If you're feeling like your sleeves are a little short, this is the easiest technique I have found to go from this to this in less than an hour. I am an upcycler, so you're going to have lots of tips that I learned after fashion design school to really speed you along the way and make it super easy for you. Starting with this first one, you can measure with anything that stays consistent. It does not need to be a measuring tape. So it can be 3 fingers, it could be a little piece of paper, it could be a string, anything that stays the same length. When you cut your cuffs out, you want to cut on a fold, otherwise you're going to end up with an extra seam in there and they're going to be too small. So I take my t-shirt and I fold it in half so that I have folds on the outside edge. And then here I'm showing using a traditional measuring technique. I add 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can add whatever seam allowance you want as long as you're consistent, or 1 finger's worth of seam allowance. And to make this cut nice and even, I mark it in 2 places, on the left side with pins. On the right side, I'm just using a Sharpie so that I can fold a straight line across those, because we're going to need an outside layer and an inside layer. Ooh, here I'm showing you something you shouldn't do, which is pull on knit fabrics. We're going to fold it in half and cut along here. And it's very important that you smooth out the back side so that you don't get little rumpled areas in there, because those make jagged edges when you cut them. And here you're going to see why pulling on that fabric didn't work so well. Because when we lay out our big rectangle, we're going to see that there's some areas that kind of pooch out. Okay, so here's my hack for fixing that. Oh, you guessed it. We're just going to trim it up. Okay, so we're going to fold our fabric in half to cut it. And I'm now using the sleeve to figure out how long I need to make this. And I'm putting my extra 1/2 inch on there for seam allowance. So that's what we're doing on the left, and on the right, I'm going to use my finger technique to mark it. And I'm just putting the ruler down so you can see that there's, something my finger's going next to. And on the left, they're traditional pins and tailor's chalk. Hey, a great substitute for tailor's chalk is a thin sliver of soap. It's free and it works just as well. So I'm highly recommending it. Then we're going to cut our little areas that we measured off and fold them out so we can see the long triangle, and fold it again the short way and match up those raw edges. Sometimes just sliding the fabric around on the top is a good way to get things to line up kind of exactly. Yeah, just kind of pushing it like that. And then we're going to sew along that short edge. Now, if you're like me, sometimes you go to the sewing machine with your knit fabrics and you put that first careful stitch in, holding your threads and back and everything, and immediately you can tell something went wrong. There's just a little sound to it, it doesn't advance smoothly, and you look at it and dang! The problem is that the presser plate foot is too big, and there are presser plates that have little narrow, you can't do zigzag stitch with it kinds of ones. But my favorite hack for this is just to take a piece of paper, like recycled paper, and put it behind at the beginning and ends of these stitches. Where you're back tacking is where things tend to get jammed into the bottom. And then I just rip that paper off after I'm done with it. So that's a bada bing one. And of course, there are 2 cuffs to do, so we're going to do both of them. Then once the cuff is put together, we're going to fold it so our seam allowance is on the inside, and it's going to start to look like a cuff here. I like to put a pin in just to hold these 2 seam lines, one right on top of the other. And if my fabric's really curly, like this one's pretty curly, then I might take a little extra time and go around and put pins in just to kind of hold it in place so that when I'm positioning it with the sleeve, it'll be easy for me. Okay, so we've got that all put together. Yes, nice. Now I'm going to just check and make sure it's the right size before I get crazy and pin it down. Oh my gosh, not even close. That's all right. I know how to fix this. I'm going to just mark where a new seam allowance goes, cut it off, sew it together, and bada bing! I have the right size cuff. Now as I slide it on here, I line up the bottom 2 seam lines and I put the fold towards the inside of the garment. Then I go to the top and I put a pin in there. And I also put a pin in through both of those seam lines, so the top and bottom pins are going to become my anchor. At this point, I like to kind of stretch everything out to even it up, and I go about halfway between the pins on the top layer, and I get all 3 layers lined up and I put a... Now what you don't want to accidentally do here is pin this with your shirt inside out. You actually want to pin this to the outside of the shirt. To sew this down, I like to work with just the arm of the machine showing, and that way I can put the cuff all the way around and sew in a circle. When I sew in a circle, I don't back tack. I overlap at the end by about an inch or a couple fingers worth, or I don't know how many centimeters, but you know, a fair amount, and that works in place of a back tack. Now you can see what happens if you pinned it to the wrong side of the fabric. On the right side, you're going to have all those seam allowances, and on the wrong side, you're going to have the inside of the garment. So if you do that, I thought it'd be helpful for you to see my favorite technique for picking seams out, which is every 2 or 3 stitches, I just break the thread, and then it becomes really easy to sort of pull the 2 layers apart. And sometimes I alternate between pulling the layers apart and snapping threads from the side that it's easy to see on. And of course, everybody has their own techniques for this, so develop your own over time, but I just thought I'd share this one with you. And seam ripping is part of sewing, so suck it up. Do the seam ripping if you need to. Okay, now everything's perfect. We're just going to sew in a circle. I'm going to line those 2 seam lines up to start so that everything's nice and flat together. Grab my threads in the back. All right, and just making sure all the way around that the bottom layer stays really smooth without any little puckers in it. All right, in this demo here, I'm actually showing you a slightly wider seam allowance than my finger. This is because I want to remove all of the original hem so that you're not seeing the hem next to the seam on the shirt. And look, it turned out great. If you have a woven fabric, then it's probably not optional to finish your seam allowances. But with a knit fabric, it sort of is. And I do that by just taking a zigzag stitch right inside the edge of the seam allowance and going all the way around. An overlock, a serger, any of those will work. Now you can see fabulous sleeves! Yay!